Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we are going to be comparing Eastern and Western thought. We'll be looking at the depth psychology of Carl Jung in comparison to the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. With me is Dr. Leanne Whitney. She teaches yoga philosophy to yoga teachers in Southern California. She is a transformational coach, and most importantly, for purposes of this interview, she is the author of Consciousness in Jung and Patanjali. Welcome again, Leanne.
Thank you, Jeff. Nice to be here.
It's a pleasure to be with you, and for the benefit of our viewers who haven't had a chance to see our earlier interviews, we did one on Jungian psychology, one on Patanjali, and now we're going to really get into the distinctions, the differences, and the commonalities between these two very, very important approaches to human consciousness and human psychic liberation.
Yes.
So where to start? let me say this by way of starting. I did a very interesting interview with a woman such as yourself who had a profound personal experience, in her case near-death experience. And she talks about what she called a spiritual bypass, which occurs in her thinking when people get involved in Eastern disciplines and they strive to achieve a state of spiritual enlightenment without working through all of their psychological issues. And it's kind of a trap that people often fall into.
Absolutely, and I think that's one of the reasons why Jung was nervous, if you will, or he warned Western people that we don't want to just take on these Eastern practices. He was definitely very, almost strict in that sense, and we don't. Spiritual bypass is not what we're after. Experiences of non-duality are. I believe, though, when you really sit with Patanjali's text, spiritual bypass is impossible because he points to markers. And he says anxiety shows up in the body, stress, depression, unrhythmic breathing. And so spiritual bypass, you know, we can walk around thinking that we're all liberated, but when you get into a real moment with a family member or with a business associate, then you'd have to be repressing once again the phenomena that's actually showing up in the body. So I think Patanjali was very clear by pointing to the physical phenomena.
Well, suppose you're practicing yoga and something like that comes up. You get anxiety, you get depression. What does Patanjali suggest you do?
He does not suggest you go to a therapist, and that's what we would obviously do here in the West. His methodology is to continue to sit with the phenomena and to distinguish it, discriminate it, go into its finer elements, and look at it and get it to more subtle form.
In other words, basic yoga practice and meditation can address anything.
That is a question, actually, that we actually are sitting with in the West, whether that's true or not. There's some Eastern scholars, actually, who also don't know the answer to that it could be that the Western psyche and what we have experienced over the last few centuries has put us in a place that we need something like Jungian methodology before we approach yoga. Right now, the jury is out, I would say, in the West.
In fact, what we don't have, to my understanding, are good statistics at all on how many people who practice meditation even stick with it after a year, or yoga after a year. I have heard, and I did one interview with a scholar of meditation, Dr. Charles Tart. He said one meditation teacher told him, well, maybe if we're lucky, 5% of our students will be around in a year.
Right. Yes, I don't know those statistics either. And just to go back to the previous point just a bit, I would imagine that in Patanjali's day and age, the guru culture, so whoever your yoga teacher was, then when something was up for you, you would then consult the teacher.
Oh, yeah.
So the teacher must have been some kind of therapist per se for those instances when the student was really struggling or suffering.
Yeah. Well, that makes sense. And the other thing that we didn't really address in our interview on Patanjali, and maybe you can give me an idea as to how this fits in, are forms of yoga like Bhakti Yoga, Jnana Yoga, Raja Yoga, that don't necessarily involve the postures of yoga at all.
No, they don't. They don't involve the posture. So there's many different streams of yoga, but they all coalesce around this idea of self-realization. They're in agreement on that, but it's just different ways and means of. Well,
self-realization in Hindu and yoga philosophy, and in particular in Patanjali, is realizing the divine nature within oneself.
Right, realizing that we are divinity itself. Absolutely, yes.
And it's not an intellectual realization, it is a realization that goes beyond words.
Right, it's direct, and when we really sort of look at the essence of the word realization, it's a good word because we realize it. We don't acquire it. It's not acquired through some kind of thinking function or studying the text per se. We can study the text, there's no doubt about that, but it is not, it's realized from within, from direct experience.
Whereas in Western culture, when we think of realization, enlightenment, self-actualization, these terms have a very different connotation. For example, the term the Enlightenment. We say Western culture in the 17th, 18th century went through the Enlightenment, but they weren't referring to a spiritual enlightenment at all. They were referring to political and philosophical forms of enlightenment.
That's true, Jeff, and I feel like it was anything but an enlightenment in the sense that we had such a schism between science and religion. And I really feel like Euro-American culture still suffers from that schism to this day. So it really wasn't an enlightenment.
How do you see that suffering affecting us?
Science, and Jung actually spoke to this deeply. Materialist science, orthodox science, that is very divorced from religious experience. It's one thing to be skeptical about religion and sort of dogmatic, let's say, religious traditions. But Jung's idea was that you can't strip the gods out of the picture. They will return. And so he aimed to bring religious experience into science. But as you and I probably both know, orthodox science considers religious experience a dysfunction of brain process as opposed to a function of brain process.
I think we have to be very careful about ascribing any particular point of view to orthodox science because it's changing so rapidly.
That's true.
And particular scientists will express that point of view for sure. It's not an uncommon point of view, but I think we're in an era now where it's being widely challenged.
Especially in the field of consciousness studies. So absolutely, you're right to correct, to make a good correction there.
But the distinction, for example, Abraham Maslow, a great Western psychologist, big inspiration in my life. He studied mystics around the world, and then he studied very accomplished people in Western culture, Einstein or Eleanor Roosevelt, and he discovered that people such as Einstein or Eleanor Roosevelt had what he called peak experiences, very similar to mystical experiences, maybe not even differentiable. Houston Smith, a scholar of the world's religions, compared the reports of people on psychedelic drugs with the reports of the great mystics, and he determined they're very hard to distinguish one from the other in terms of the experience itself, that the difference was in the lifestyle that came out of the experience, not the experience. But in general, if you're an enlightened Westerner by Maslow's standards, you're highly accomplished, you're out in the world doing things, you're a creative artist or a scholar, an influential person. But in Eastern thought, enlightenment means something quite different, wouldn't you say?
I would say so. I think in the West we have this love affair with visibility. We're out in the world doing something.
An individual personality, the individual becomes so important.
It really does in our culture.
Yeah.
We tend to almost marginalize to a really great degree the less than visible in our culture.
Yeah.
And but in the East, it isn't about necessarily becoming very visible and very active in the world. It's about authentic nature. It's about being really true to oneself, and that could mean a whole variety of things. It can be, becoming, or not even, a mother in a household, caring for your children. A gardener, anybody, anywhere, in other words. It's not...
There is a sense that people sometimes think of the East as more feminine and the West as more masculine.
They do, and I can see why they do that. Can you?
I can see it, although I'm aware of the fact that, the social habits of male dominance exist worldwide. They're not limited to the West.
That's true.
So, yet there is a sense in which Eastern culture maybe is passive. In some respects, it's quite passive.
And it actually also, though, relegates the feminine to a very elevated point. We've talked about Shakti.
Yes.
Yes. So the feminine Durga. I mean, there's a lot of feminine
the goddesses are much more prominent in Eastern and particularly in Hindu culture than, the female deity is almost extinct in the West.
That's right, and it's very prominent. And so that's where I go when you talk about the feminine. As far as passive goes, I think we can see that as well, in the sense that our Western culture has industrialization has by and large come up through the West. We've colonized a lot of places.
Yes.
I don't believe India has. I mean, we attempted to colonize India, and she found a strength to stand on her own.
Roughly non-violently, too.
Yeah, so I'm curious as far as that. Is that passive voice in relationship to the aggression, and I'll use the word aggression, that we tend to show, the more active aggression that we tend to show? I'm not sure on that.
Well, let's be more specific now about Jung and Patanjali. Jung studied the Yoga Sutras.
Yes, he did. He absolutely did, and he gave lectures on it, actually.
And he also seemed very much to be in admiration of that tradition.
He found a lot of parallel evidence to his own, what he called the individuation process, the psycho-spiritual development of the personality. He found a lot of parallel evidence in those Eastern cultures, both Buddhism and yoga.
As I recall, you maintain that Jung misinterpreted some aspects of Patanjali.
He felt in the end that Eastern intuition had overreached itself, that consciousness that isn't associated with an ego was what he and Freud and the depth psychologists termed the unconscious. So in the end, he parted, even though he found parallel evidence, he didn't stick with these traditions as the most influential. He turned to alchemy and Taoism, actually.
In other words, well, you say Taoism, which is a Chinese form of spirituality, but he emphasized the working with the archetypes, with the mythological structures of the unconscious. And we don't find that in the Yoga Sutras, do we?
We don't. I question whether when Patanjali speaks to Ishvara, which is the supreme Purusha, omniscient, I'm wondering if we could look at that from an archetypal perspective. I'm not sure that we can, but maybe we can.
Yeah.
Also in Mahayana Buddhism, they speak to the Tathagata text, which is the fact that the Buddha seed is in all of us. So that idea of a seed is sort of like an imprint, right? Archetypes are about imprints. I think we may be able to find some similarity there, but not directly, no.
And you referred in an earlier interview to the emphasis on dreams in the Yoga Sutras. Let's go into that a little more.
There's one sutra where Patanjali speaks to looking at dreams or the deep dream state as a possible means of stabilizing the mind. He gives so many options. Yeah.
And what does he say? How do you do that?
He doesn't.
Well, I know that in the Tibetan tradition, there's what they call the dream yoga.
Yes, I think it's much more explicated in that tradition. Patanjali just gives one sentence and says this is one possible means of stabilizing the mind.
I mean, Freud, for example, wrote the classic book on the interpretation of dreams.
It's very big in depth psychology, dream interpretation, absolutely. Yes.
But we don't find dream interpretation in yoga traditions.
Well, just in that one brief sutra, it doesn't really give the detail.
You know many yoga teachers. Do any of them practice dream interpretation?
I don't know too many teachers, actually, that look at the philosophy that Patanjali wrote out, and look at all the methodologies. No.
All right, and that's fair. I mean, you teach yoga philosophy to Western yoga teachers in Southern California. So they're learning themselves.
Yes.
It's not as if we have here in the West lineages that have been around for a long time that we can observe.
No, not yoga lineages for dream interpretation. No.
Yeah.
No.
They may exist for all we know in places like India.
That's right. They could. Yeah.
But I've never heard of them.
I haven't either.
I know Sri Aurobindo, a great yogi, wrote extensive diaries. Maybe in there one would find an emphasis on dream interpretation.
Yes, and same with the mother, right? She, his partner, she also had extensive writing. She may have as well. I know she worked with the body a lot, for sure. She brought the body into it, but I'm not clear on whether she brought dreams in.
So, to the extent that yoga is the psychotherapy, one might say, of the East, is very different from psychotherapeutic traditions in the West.
One main difference is, if we're going to narrow it down to Jung and Patanjali, is Jung in the end didn't believe that liberation was possible. He thought that the sufferings of this world would always continue. Patanjali has a different outlook to that. He believes that we can arrest suffering through his methodology in particular. And that's a very, very distinct difference between these two outlooks, for sure.
I wonder, here's one of my takes on it. If we were to point to somebody who really supposedly enlightened in the Eastern tradition, well, Gautama Buddha would be such a person. I think universally regarded as enlightened.
Yes.
In both the Hindu and the Buddhist traditions.
Yes.
I would say. But I recall a story from the life of the Buddha in which the Buddhist women, want to be admitted into the order as monks. And the Buddha said to his assistant, Ananda, who was his cousin, and wrote down, and his scribe as well, Buddha said, he said, Buddhism will last 1,000 years, but if I admit women, it will only last 500.
Wow.
That's what the Buddha said. That's from the lips of an enlightened being. And he was wrong on both scores.
Right, that's right. That's right. Buddhism definitely has gone through ups and downs. I think it's been popular and not so popular. But that perhaps plays to your point also about the feminine being denigrated all over the globe.
Yes, it does that, but it also seems to suggest that maybe Jung was right. Maybe if the Buddha himself would make such an incorrect pronouncement, then our ideas of enlightenment, maybe it's mistaken to think that an enlightened being is perfect.
What is perfect? Right. What is the perfectibility of human nature?
Yeah.
Yes. Yes, that's the question too at the heart of this. Is there perfectibility? And if there is, what is it? But I believe Patanjali is saying it's clearing the lens of perception so we can, see and therefore become integrated, if you will, or enact the integration. And we brought up this point in one of our other talks. Patanjali actually ends his text in language of the feminine gender. Now, we don't have much history on Patanjali, so we really don't know how he came up, how he came through, what his private life was like. But I always find it very interesting, if not important, that he does end the text in feminine language.
I would imagine that perhaps Jung was thinking that for a person to be truly realized, self-realized, it can only occur in the context of a culture that is also realized and supports realization. If the culture itself is destructive and detrimental, even a realized being is going to have fundamental conflicts.
I would think so. I remember Robert Thurman once saying that the Buddha incarnated in India because India could imagine him, and that really rang true to me. Carl Jung is interesting in the sense that he really wanted to come up with his own yoga, a Western yoga, almost like a Christianized form of yoga. So in the end, I think there was a bit in him where he didn't want to give over fully to the methodology, perhaps in Patanjali's sutras.
And he never was a yoga practitioner himself.
You can find here and there where he talks about doing some postures in order to calm himself emotionally. I've read recently, actually, there's some archives at Harvard where he speaks to stillness, which I don't find anywhere in the collected works. So apparently there's some private documents that he has, but you have to really look for it.
It wouldn't be surprising that he might have dabbled.
Oh, not at all. No, not at all. I think he submitted to a lot of these practices, but
not with the intensity and discipline that he approached depth psychology.
No, exactly right. And so, if Patanjali's methodology, if you have to sit with it for 12, 15 years, then, is Jung really in a position to comment on it? And that's the question we also have to look at here in the West. Because in the end, Jung said, no, these practices aren't for Westerners. But, we are importing them with great speed, and people are absolutely finding help and assistance with their own suffering.
In our earlier interview, you revealed that after 7 months of yoga practice, you spontaneously experienced, for a very brief moment, a state that might be akin to what is called samadhi. And it transformed your life permanently.
Yes, it's what's in the religious studies literature. It's called a pure consciousness event. Yes, it totally, it irrevocably transformed it. There was no going back to seeing the world the way that I had seen it for 33 years prior to that.
And is there anything comparable in Jung's autobiographical writings?
To that moment? No, and that actually brings up a point. So I had what's called a pure consciousness event, and there's no pure consciousness actually mentioned in Jung's depth psychology at all. As a matter of fact, pure consciousness is strikingly absent from Western thought in general. And in my book, one of my hopes is to bring it to the table and bring it into the dialogue. But pure consciousness is nowhere to be found. He does allude to a supraconsciousness. A superconsciousness for sure, but he never speaks to purity, and he really doesn't speak to stilling the mind at all.
And I know there's a book by Bucky called on cosmic consciousness, which seems sort of akin
to pure consciousness.
Yeah, well, it's not exactly pure consciousness. It's more like consciousness of everything at once.
Right, exactly. It's it's absolute. It's eternal. It's a totality. Yes, there's no other. There's no other for sure.
So would you call that the same as pure consciousness?
Cosmic consciousness?
Yeah.
You could, if there was to be a hierarchy, I would say pure consciousness would be the top. Cosmic consciousness, again, is this idea that there's a lot of contents, perhaps, to the cosmos. So pure consciousness, at least through my POV, that's the realization that consciousness is all there is. And perhaps the same in cosmic consciousness, I'm not really sure.
Well, I do know that in the Eastern literature, there's so many gradations and fine nuances related to different states that are called mukti or samadhi or satori, or one could go on, and all of the nuances that are reported in nirvana.
Sure.
We don't have that in the West at all.
No, we do not have that in the West at all. We don't really speak to samadhi, although now Patanjali specifically, he speaks to samprajnata samadhi, which is an absorption, but there's still some contents, there's still some conceptualization around it. And then he speaks to asamprajnata samadhi, and that's when the conceptualizations have disbanded, but there's still some imprints, there's still some fine imprints left. If we want to place Jung into Patanjali's model, we would put him in the samprajnata. He was, I'm sure, having states of absorption. You can absolutely find these descriptions in his autobiography, Memories, Dreams, Reflections, where he feels at one with everything. But his conceptualization was still very active for him right up until the end.
Now, I think that one of the important areas where Eastern and Western thought come together, and by Western thought I'm referring to Jung, now, who I regard as one of the leading Western thinkers of our modern era, is the area of the paranormal.
Yes, they do. Jung studied the paranormal for a long period of time. His mother had some level of psychic abilities. His cousin had mediumistic abilities, and he did his doctoral dissertation on that. He studied psychic phenomena for a long period of time, ESP, synchronicities, and Patanjali dedicates almost a whole chapter of his book to psychic phenomena. So
he calls them the siddhis.
That's right, the powers.
The powers that one accumulates from yoga practice, which are important milestones along the way, but are not to be confused with the goal.
In any way, shape, or form. It's very important, yes. He brings them to bear, and I think it's healthy to bring them to bear, because if clairvoyance begins to be developed, you can be where am I now, and what is right as you break into a cosmic level of consciousness, per se, multi-sensory perception. So it's very important to bring it in, but he's very clear to say, but hey, don't hang on to this even. This becomes an object. You can objectify this as well.
So is there a distinction in your mind between the Tantric tradition and the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali?
I don't feel like I have enough knowledge about Tantra, but I do feel like you can see Tantra, how do I want to say this, come into yoga, again, by this idea that we can read it as a non-dual text, and that he brings, Shakti, the power of the feminine in at the end. I do believe you can see Tantra in there, yes.
I get the impression that the Tantric tradition is a bit more open to working with these siddhis or powers than one would find in the classic Yoga Sutras.
Yes, I think that's true. Yeah.
And another point where I think there could be commonality between Eastern traditions and Western science now is our knowledge and our interest in reincarnation.
That's right, because we have a lot of work now. Stan Groff, with his holotropic breath work, he works with hundreds of people who are showing evidence or having experiences of past lives. Ian Stevenson left behind a vast body of work.
Which is ongoing at the University of Virginia.
Excellent, yeah. So we definitely have a lot of evidence amassing.
There have been many scientific papers published from the team at the University of Virginia and from other researchers worldwide looking into especially young children who remember past lives.
Yes, it seems easier for young children. And this was really before Jung's day. Jung didn't have an opportunity to see this research. So for him, it was up in the air. He didn't really know whether reincarnation was a thing or not.
But certainly it's important in Buddhism, it's important in Vedanta. I don't know that it's mentioned in the Yoga Sutras, but one would think it's sort of integral to yoga practice.
Yes, because he does absolutely speak to the past, for sure, the past and the future and everything being embedded. He does talk about transitioning between species. Some of the sutras actually are really interesting. I'm not a Sanskrit scholar, and when you take 15 translations back to back, it's amazing how different people translate them. But there is a translation in the 4th chapter where it could be seen as, going from one body to the next. And yeah, so it's definitely, you can find it there.
But both Patanjali and Jung considered that what they were developing were disciplines for acquiring knowledge and for acquiring states of consciousness that implicitly embody knowledge, and doing it in a way that they considered, well, certainly Jung, I'm not sure that Patanjali would have had the language, but scientific.
Yes, for sure. Patanjali would be radically empirical, really, because you're the petri dish, if you will.
Yeah.
You're the test tube. I would say it's important also to note the difference between knowledge, perhaps, that Patanjali was pointing to versus Jung.
Yeah.
In the West, in our academic institutions, it's about the accumulation and the building of knowledge and the building of knowing. Yes, Jung did absolutely speak and direct people to direct experience, but in the end, his philosophy and his theory falls upon the isolated mind. In Patanjali's work, it's different. It isn't about the isolated mind. It's about absorption into cosmic mind, if you will, and therefore knowledge is structured in consciousness, in this pure consciousness, which is reality. Do you see the difference? Yeah.
I do.
Yeah.
I see that difference, and it's very nice for you to highlight it this way. Well, Leanne, once again, we've had a fascinating conversation about deep and important issues concerning both Eastern and Western culture and some of the leading approaches on both sides of the globe. One of the points I know you make is that this distinction between East and West in our era is really somewhat artificial because we inherit it all.
That's right. It is artificial, and I think as we continue to do work like this dialogue, hold the dialogues between Jung and Patanjali, and psychologists really need to come together and perhaps create a framework or a map. If healing of human suffering is what we really want, then I believe psychologists all around the globe need to sit at a table and hold conversation, and that, the West can't walk away with its own ideas of how we build knowledge or what the psyche does, that we really need to have everybody at the table discussing what knowledge is and what consciousness is.
Well, you are an important pioneer in that movement, and so I'm very glad to have had this time with you.
Thank you, Jeff. I appreciate being here.
Thank you for being with me. And thank you for being with us.